Joining us now for tonight's episode of Election Protection is our friend Ari Berman, a Mother Jones national voting rights correspondent, author of books including Minority Rule, The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People, and The Fight to Resist It, as well as Give Us the Ballot. Ari, nice to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Dean, great to see you again. Thank you.
So we'll go through it more granular detail, but overall, if you were looking at this midterm versus other elections, how concerned are you about there being an effort to really rig and cheat in this election, unlike so many others?
Very concerned because we've never had an administration try to interfere in a midterm election in this fashion. Usually, what presidents try to do in the midterms is sell their party's agenda to the public. Trump hasn't even attempted to do that. Every time he's told to sell his agenda, he basically just undercuts his own case and said affordability is a hoax and all this stuff. And so basically, he is completely fixated on trying to manipulate the mechanics of voting to ensure that his party wins. That seems to be the only strategy that Republicans have to try to keep the House and the Senate. And so they're doing it through a variety of ways. They tried to do the gerrymandering. That worked, but only to a point because Democrats decided to fight back. They've tried to change voting laws. That has so far been unsuccessful. And now they're redoubling efforts to try to not just pass those voting laws, but to try to meddle in state and federal elections in some other kind of form. So I think we should expect this to increase and for the administration to get more desperate and extreme as it looks more likely that they will lose one or both chambers of Congress.
It's interesting Trump didn't make the case to the American people for his agenda for the midterm. He didn't even make a case for war. He just went to war. We're living through something it's very anti-democratic. Everything that you're touching on, including the failure to go to the American people to make a case for war. When you don't view the people as voters or constituents, but subjects, that's what you do. And that's what we're living through. So I'm concerned. So I want to get, you've written many articles from Mother Jones about this. What was your reaction when you heard Trump talk about we could take over voting in at least 15 places? What do you think they're going to try to do?
Well, it was extremely disturbing because the president doesn't have the power to unilaterally take over voting. The Constitution is very clear that states run elections with oversight from Congress, and they specifically did not give the president that authority because they worried that the president would become another king or wannabe dictator like Trump. And so it was disturbing because it suggested that things like raiding the ballots in Fulton County, Georgia, that kind of activity could become more commonplace, and that they were going to take further action to try to give themselves the power to take over voting. For example, some of Trump's advisors are trying to urge him to invoke a national emergency so that he could seize voting machines, so that he could stop mail-in voting. This is the kind of thing that people like Sidney Powell and Mike Flynn and Patrick Byrne tried to get Trump to do in 2020. He was talked off the ledge by his advisors, but he's surrounded by enablers now. The president remains obsessed with 2020. He's obsessed with the fact that he might lose in 2026. There might be real oversight in Congress. So when he says take over the voting, he can't do it unilaterally, but I think he's going to try to use every lever he has, whether it's leaning on local allies, weaponizing law enforcement, or pushing the power of the presidency to limits we've never seen before.
How concerned, it's not about freaking people out. We're so far advanced that we have enough time to work on safeguards. But how concerned are you that he sends the FBI while ballots are being counted to scoop them up, or military or ICE or whatever federal apparatus?
I don't think you can rule anything out. And I think that's the reason why people have to be proactive about it, because we have to anticipate the next threat to be able to combat it. And there has to be bipartisan blowback against it. This can't just be a thing that Democrats oppose. The reason why the system held to the extent that it did hold in 2020 is because a lot of Republicans stood up to Trump at the state and local level. It was Republicans who certified the election, places like Georgia, places like Michigan, places like Arizona. And that same kind of thing has to happen again, because this can't just be a thing where Republicans try to seize voting machines and Democrats try to defend it. The whole idea of doing this is so crazy and antithetical. You would hope that more Republicans start to speak out against these attempts at executive overreach. And the one thing I will say is, the one thing that I have found to be somewhat hopeful is, for example, the Department of Justice has tried to get voter data from all 50 states, and they've sued 29 states as of now. And a bunch of Republican states have said no. They've only got
Mhm.
this data from 11 states so far. And yeah, it's disturbing that 11 states handed sensitive voter information over to the White House, but that means that a lot of states haven't done it. Places like West Virginia, places like Kentucky, places like Oklahoma, they are saying no to the administration. So I think there's a bipartisan support for states running elections. And the fact that the system is so decentralized, particularly in a midterm, where it's not like we're not talking about 5 or 6 states, we're talking about races that are taking place all across the country in different districts and different jurisdictions. That makes it harder for
Mhm.
Trump to try to manipulate the outcome.
Now, the SAVE Act, which passed the House and may or may not pass the Senate, we don't know. I don't really count on. I don't want to count on the filibuster to save us. The same thing that I actually hate the filibuster. Now I have to look for it to save us. How much is that about consolidating power and putting the power in the president and Donald Trump to try to run elections and undermine the whole scheme that was set up by the framers?
There's elements of that. For example, the new version of the SAVE Act gives the Department of Homeland Security the power to police state voter rolls. That would be a dramatic expansion of executive authority. Other parts of it, for example, requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, requiring ID to cast a ballot, that goes through the congressional process. It doesn't actually affect how elections are conducted, but
Mhm.
it would require documentation that tens of millions of Americans don't have. And the thing that's so interesting about that, particularly the proof of citizenship part of it, is that 21 million Americans don't have ready access to their citizenship documents. And I would argue that understates the impact because most people don't carry around a passport or a birth certificate with them, unlike a
Right.
driver's license. So these are not things that Americans are accustomed to having on them on a regular basis. They've never been required at a federal level or even by most states to register before, but that really undercounts who'd be affected because there are 69 million married women that have changed their names that could be impacted by this. That's a more Republican than
I know.
Democratic constituency. Also, you have to show this documentation in person at an elections office. That means people in rural areas have to travel further to be able to register. That's also a more Republican constituency. So I don't think that Republicans have clearly thought this through. I think Trump is so obsessed with the idea of passing this, they're just overlooking the fact that some of their own voters would be most harmed by this. Also, burdens on voting tend to impact people that are less frequent voters and less motivated to vote. Well, in 2026, Democrats are going to have more motivated voters and more frequent voters turn out. So if you're talking about putting in place new barriers to voting, Democrats are going to be more than willing to travel 5 hours to an elections office to show their documentation. It's Republicans that are going to say, hell with it. I don't want to show up. And so I think that is one reason why a lot of Republicans in the Senate are not that crazy about the SAVE Act. They've signed on to it, but I think if you polled them privately, a lot of them would be more than happy to have this thing just die.
Yeah, I mean, they do their own calculations and like, okay, we're gonna lose some of ours, but they must think we'll hurt more Democrats or people who support Democrats, but they don't really know. And these things play out in a different way. I mean, the enthusiasm is on the side of Democrats right now. We're 6.5 months out, but still, it really is. Doesn't it undermine like part of this is a voter ID, and they try to only talk about the voter ID, not everything else, because people hear about the other stuff, like what is going on. But the fact Trump talks about voter ID and at the same time Georgia had voter ID in 2020 with photo, and he's still litigating that. Doesn't it on some level undermine the whole claim
Yeah.
that voter ID will solve everything?
Well, exactly. I mean, they added voter ID to it because they wanted to use the usual talking points. You need ID to get on a plane, you need ID to buy liquor. We'll
Right.
leave aside the fact that those are not constitutionally protected rights in the same way as voting. But the fact is, the bill goes much further than voter ID. The proof of citizenship thing and handing over to either the state voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security are a much bigger deal. And it's going to hurt a lot of Republican minded voters. It's the same reason why Republicans don't want to ban mail voting. Every time
Yeah.
Trump says, I want to ban mail in voting, the smart Republican strategists' eyes roll because they know this would be bad for the Republican Party. The ways to compete in an election in this day and age is to urge people to vote whichever way they feel most comfortable voting, to give them as many options as possible. That's how life works in this day and age. So, I mean, If you want to vote by mail, you don't want to wait in a long line, you live in a rural area, you have some kind of condition, you vote by mail. You don't want to wait in a long line on election day, you vote early. You have lots of different options to vote. You want to vote the traditional way, you like going in on a Tuesday in November, fine, you can do that. But a lot of people decide they don't want to do that. And so
Mhm.
the smart Republican strategists have turned out their voters by basically saying we should have as many options as possible. Trump is trying to undercut that. That is not popular among Republicans. It would not help Republicans. I keep talking about this because I don't think you're going to make a moral case to Republicans why
Right.
they shouldn't do this. But I do think you can make a political case to them on why this is bad. And that's why, for example, the ban on mail voting didn't make it in to the Save America Act. Even the legislation that's not going to pass Congress, they said we don't even want this in here. It's too extreme. And so I think that they're just focused on all of these issues that don't matter to the American public, wouldn't even have that much impact in the long run, and that C would be bad for their own voters. And that's why the legislation is likely not going to pass. The thing that worries me, however, is that if it doesn't pass, Trump is going to point to its failure as another reason to say the elections were crooked. And
Right.
that's where the weaponization of law enforcement and some of that kind of abuse of executive authority comes in.
I'm chatting with Ari Berman, Mother Jones National Voting Rights Correspondent. So, Ari, I mean, Trump already signed an executive order for some of this. If this doesn't pass the Senate, he'll sign another one trying to turn it. In his mind, he thinks he can sign it and it becomes law.
Yeah.
Executive order, it's persuasive in a way, and it could become policy. But if he were to sign his executive order, at that point, you just think there'll be lawsuits to try to stop it, and it's a little easier because it's executive order than a law.
Yes. I mean, his last executive order on elections was blocked by multiple courts. I would imagine a second executive order in which he's going to try to do even more extreme things is even more likely to be blocked. There's already a precedent for blocking the first executive order. So why wouldn't there be a precedent to blocking a second one? The latest proposals by his allies are so absolutely crazy. The idea that Trump could declare a national emergency based on Chinese interference in the 2020 election. I mean, this is so crazy that they're even talking about this. I mean, first off, there's no evidence that China or any other country interfered in the election. So you have to have evidence to
Right.
be able to justify this before a court. You don't need to have the evidence for an executive order, but you need it for the evidence to stand up in court. Secondly, the president can't just declare a national emergency. There has to be a reason for him to do so. And even the Supreme Court has been skeptical of Trump's ability to do this. For example, they blocked the National Guard deployments. They ruled that tariffs were unconstitutional. So there's now two really solid precedents with the tariffs and with the National Guard deployment that Trump can't do this kind of thing. And the voting related order would exist on even shakier ground. So I'm sure if he does it, everyone's going to panic. It's going to be full five-alarm fire time for everybody. Blue Sky is going to go absolutely nuts. And it's worrisome. It's crazy that Trump would do something so blatantly dictatorial. But in terms of its ability to stand up in the courts, I think even a Republican-dominated judiciary would not allow Trump to assume dictatorial power to declare a national emergency based on imagined interference and old grievances in an election.
We have to hope that, and you have to hope the Supreme Court, in the tariff case, showed a little bit of, reasonableness, like in that they applied common sense. It really should have been a 9-0 decision, but at least it was 6-3. So it does show a little bit of a desire. Like if Trump doesn't have the express power, I don't know as a lawyer where the national emergency comes in. Like you just signed executive orders in national emergency. We don't have elections. I don't know
No.
where's the basis for that. I don't
There's
see.
no basis for it. First
Right.
off, executive orders are basically suggestions. They apply to the executive branch.
Right.
States are not required to follow them. So Trump can't force a state to do anything via executive order. Secondly, you can't just invent executive authority. There has to be some basis for it. And the basis for invoking it would basically be economic laws you're invoking to try to say that you have the power to seize voting machines to end mail-in voting. I mean, that's even more ludicrous than the tariffs. Trump could at least say, okay, there's some economic basis for the tariffs. I
Right.
mean, the Supreme Court disagreed, but he could at least this not even you can't even try to even argue this case. And so I get why his advisors are acting and his allies are acting like he operates in this law-free dictatorial zone. I think Trump would love to thinks of himself that way, thinks of himself as above the law. But when it comes to elections, we're seeing a consistent pattern where Trump's desire to have control is running squarely up against the Constitution. And, and that is a problem for him that he cannot seem to be able to circumvent.
And it's only a problem because some judges have stood up to him. Because as we've learned, that the Constitution is not self-executing and that it has to be protected. And if the judiciary did not stand up to him, we'd be in a grave problem. Now, I want to, you just wrote an article for Mother Jones about a case yesterday where the Supreme Court actually didn't hear the case, but there was an opinion by Alito, a concurring opinion, which was very concerning. And I live in New York, and it was potentially going to impact the district I live in, but especially downtown where Dan Goldman is and Nicole Malatakis in Staten Island, and even Brad Lander, who's challenging Dan Goldman, was really hoping this would go this way so he could have his own district in Brooklyn. But tell people about it, because the Supreme Court, there was a judge here in New York that said it's unconstitutional discrimination based on race for the way it was drafted. And then the Supreme Court goes, nope, you can't hear the case. We're going to stop you. So what can you share with us?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty wild decision because the New York State Court, under state law, ruled that this district in Staten Island needed to be redrawn because it discriminated against Black and Hispanic voters. Right. The federal courts and Supreme Court have deferred to state courts on matters of state law. Well, in this case, they overturned a state court on state law, which is very rare. They've also said to courts, don't change election laws in the middle of an election. Well, the filing deadline has already passed in New York, and they're changing election law. So a lot of precedents were overturned by the court in a situation where it seemed like they just wanted to preserve a Republican-held seat when it came down to it. But the really disturbing part was the concurrence, because again, this is another emergency case in which the Supreme Court did not explain its reasoning, which is absolutely maddening to people. But Justice Alito did explain his reasoning in a concurring opinion, and basically what he said was drawing a district to help minority voters, and he put minority voters in quotes, which in and of itself was revealing. He said was as odious a form of discrimination as the discrimination that gave rise to the 14th Amendment. So he's basically saying drawing a district to elect a Black or Hispanic member of Congress is as bad as a legacy of slavery or Jim Crow. I mean, it was such a crazy ahistorical thing to say, but the really disturbing thing is if you've been following the court, there's this really important ruling on the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. They have not handed down yet as it pertains to redistricting, as it pertains to these majority-minority districts, particularly in the South. And there's a lot of speculation that Alito has the majority opinion in this case because he hasn't authored an opinion from the October term when this case was heard. And so if Alito has the majority opinion, the Voting Rights Act is dead. I mean, I think it's fair to say if Alito has the opinion, he will either kill the Voting Rights Act outright, it's already been severely weakened by the courts multiple times, or he will just narrow it to the point of irrelevancy through a bunch of legalese that makes it impossible to enforce. And so maybe the hope is that, okay, they gave Alito his moment in this New York redistricting case. Nobody else signed on to his concurrence. Fine, we'll let him be the outspoken one here. But the worry is that Chief Justice Roberts often assigns these voting cases to Alito. And he's made it very clear that he basically believes that any effort to try to ameliorate the effects of centuries of discrimination is in and of itself racist. And so that's very, very worrisome for the future of the Voting Rights Act. And this has both long-term implications for the country's most important civil rights law, but short-term implications. If they rule in the coming days or weeks, this could allow Republicans to shift up to a dozen seats from Democrats to the GOP. And I mean, that really could prevent Democrats from taking back the House, much more than any of these other interventions that President Trump has tried to do when it comes to voting.
Yeah, I mean, I just chatted with Elie Mystal last week, who said he thinks it's gone. He thinks the Voting Rights Act is dead, or gutted to the point where it doesn't have any more impact anymore. The whole question is waiting, the idea and the time, and this continuum of time. When does it come out? If it comes out at the end of the term, June or July, or June, I mean, today's the first primaries. So you're going to have to redistrict Texas, which would be just giddy to do that. You have a primary right now. But if you go a couple more months and later, I was wondering if you saw anything in the Supreme Court saying, okay, we're not going to let you touch the map in New York because in our view, it's too close, even though that's not stated, explicitly, but maybe that they're kind of saying, okay, the voting rights thing, we're going to give you so late, it's not going to have an impact either. So we're just trying to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends what the goal is of the court. If the court wants to inflict maximum damage, they'll do it earlier. If the court wants to inflict a lot of damage but not be seen as interfering in the election, they'll wait. Because if they wait until June, it'll only shift a few seats. It'll be a huge issue in 2028, but that will also give blue states more time to redistrict in response. Places like New York, for example, that weren't able to redistrict because of constraints in 2026, they could do it in 2028. I think the Supreme Court is always going to rule unfairly to Democrats. At the end of the day, they're always going to have some kind of double standard that allows Republicans to win over Democrats. It's just a question of how badly and how much and when is too far. And so I'm very worried about this case, but you're right, to Ellie's point, the timing really matters here. And a lot of us were worried this would come down in January or February. It could still come down. It could come down tomorrow for all we know. I mean, but I think the longer it doesn't come down, the more it suggests that either they're not ready, there's lots of back and forth in terms of dissents and things like that, or even if they are ready, they're just going to say, let's do this at the end of the term like we normally do so that it doesn't become a central issue in the midterms.
That's what I hope. Well, Ari, look, I want to thank you. There's always more stuff to cover, but we're out of time. Thank you for being on. Where can people follow your work? You do such great stuff with Mother Jones.
They can follow me at motherjones.com, and they can also follow me at Blue Sky at Ari Berman.
Well, thanks, Ari, and look forward to chat with you more frequently, especially getting into the election cycle. And if you have a new book at any time, you're on. So let us know, my friend.
Definitely. Great to see you again.